Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good day to all of you who have joined us to learn about the life and legacy of Matilda Olkinaite, a young Jewish-Lithuanian poet who perished in the Holocaust. We are very grateful to know that in our audience today, there are people from all corners of the US as well as from across the globe. Today's virtual conference is sponsored by the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania in the US as part of the commemorative year honoring the Vilna Gaon and highlighting the history of the Jewish people in Lithuania. Partners in the event include the Lithuanian Ministry of Culture, the Lithuanian Embassy in Canada, the Lithuanian consulates in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, as well as the Lithuanian Cultural Attaché in the US. My name is Ina Nevezelskis. I conduct oral history interviews here in Washington, D.C. at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I will be your moderator today. I would like now to invite Lithuania's ambassador to the United States, the Honorable Rolandas Kriščiūnas, to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you could hear me. And of course, it's my great honor to say good morning and good afternoon and good evening to you, because this event spans across the time zones. Of course, this year is very special for Lithuania. All year is dedicated to the richness of history, the Jewish culture in Lithuania and Vilna Gaon. An embassy has planned a number of events. Of course, via coronavirus has forced us to go to the virtual events, and that's one of the first ones we are organizing. On this, I think the thematics are very powerful. Matilda Olkinaite, the young poetress, her life was cut short by Holocaust. And of course, it's a big tragedy, and it's a big shadow, which we do have covering our Jewish heritage of Lithuania. And therefore, this powerful story encompasses all important things, which we have to look in our Jewish heritage and what we could find in there. So Matilda Olkinaite basically was killed just right after she graduated from high school. Her life was full of poetry, full of hope, and a lot of expectations. And this story is so powerful that what I want to do is just to step aside and to let the very distinguished panelists we have today to uncover this wonderful life. That's the least we could do to really celebrate this young, short life cut short, full of poetry, all of us, and remember the richness of Jewish heritage of Lithuania. And I would like to, of course, as an ambassador, always it's my duty to thank all involved. First of all, of course, I would like to thank you, to thank my staff, which put a lot of effort to make this event happen. Of course, Ina Nevezelskis, which we cooperated on a number of events from Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Ina, for joining us and helping us to put forward to everybody's attention this powerful story of young poetress today. And of course, consulates in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, cultural attaché in New York, our distinguished panelists, and embassy in Canada. If virus forced us on virtual stage, one plus of this is that we could go across the globe with the event, with our outreach, and of course across the time zones. And as Ina mentioned, we are happy to have some people joining us even from Australia and Brazil today to look in this powerful story. So without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to this wonderful, strong, powerful event on Matilda Olkinaite's life, and ask you, Ina, take good care of this event. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Before we delve into the content of today's conference, I'd like to share with you a little bit about how we'll proceed. We have three distinguished panelists with us, all of whom have deep expertise on the life of Matilda Olkinaite. Each will speak for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we'll have time for questions and answers. Please write your questions in the Q&A function that is available with Zoom. We'll try to get as many of those answered as possible, which may mean that at times we will summarize questions from a few people. At the end of the Q&A period, we will end the conference with a slideshow of photos from Matilda Olkinaite's life, photos from a theater production about her, and photos of a statue installed in her hometown in her honor and her memory. The song in the background of this slideshow was specifically created for this event by a young Lithuanian composer and singer, Liucija Vaicinavičiūtė, on the poem The Past, written by Matilda Olkinaite on December 19th, 1938. In today's conference, we will share with you how Matilda Olkinaite emerged from the anonymity of one of the 6 million murdered Jews in the Holocaust, who she was, and you will hear some of her poetry, and what she means to Lithuanian culture and literature today. All three panelists have been crucial in this process. It is my great honor to start with Lithuania's Minister of Culture, Mr. Mindaugas Kvietkauskas. And now I'll tell you a little bit about him. He is a literary scholar, writer, and translator. Since the beginning of 2019, he serves as the Minister of Culture. Before that, he worked at the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore in Vilnius for many years and managed that institution for 10 of them between 2008 and 2018. He acquired his PhD at Vilnius University and studied Yiddish language and literature at the University of Oxford Center for Hebrew and Judaic Studies. Kvietkauskas has completed internships at YIVO as well as Yale University. His main areas of research are multinational literary modernism and urban culture in Lithuania and East Central Europe. He's author of 2 academic monographs, a collection of poetry, and a book of literal essays, Uosto Fuga, The Port Fugue. He has translated several books from Polish and Yiddish languages into Lithuanian, including the works of Czesław Miłosz and Abraham Sutzkever. Recently, Kvietkauskas translated the Vilna Ghetto Diary, written by teenager Jacek Raduszewski. This was published in 2018. Compiled Unlock Diary about Matilda Olkinaite, which we are talking about today. And an homage Moiver, and my apologies to French speakers, I don't know if I pronounced that properly, a publication accompanying the reprint of a photo album called The Ghetto Lane in Vilna, by Bauhaus-trained painter and photographer Moishe Raviv Vorobaijic Moiver. The above-mentioned books were supplemented with introductory articles written by Minister Kvietkauskas. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you very much, dear Ina, for this introduction. Your Excellency Ambassador, dear participants of this meeting, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very glad to have this great opportunity to present a talent who has been almost miraculously rescued from oblivion, the poet Matilda Olkinaite, who connected the Litvak and Lithuanian cultures. I think that her story and her work carry an important moral message to all of us, those who wish to build an open and democratic dialogue between Lithuanian, Jewish, and other cultures in our contemporary world. The work of Matilda Olkinaite, who was born in 1922 and grew up in pre-war Lithuania, was characterized by a special amalgam of Jewish and Lithuanian traditions. She embodied such an identity of Litvaks, the Lithuanian Jews, which could already hardly be divided into the Lithuanian and the Jewish segment. It could already be described as binational. Matilda was a young Jewish poet who used Lithuanian as the main language in her work. She could speak Lithuanian as perfectly well as her native Yiddish. Even during the Soviet occupation, she remained faithful to both of these languages. Her worldview was characterized by Lithuanian patriotism, instilled during the interwar period in the Lithuanian gymnasiums where she studied and began her literary career. In her early poetry, her patriotism was still childish, but later in the summer of 1940, it turned into a conscious decision as Matilda clearly supported anti-communist views and condemned the then recent Soviet occupation of Lithuania, the repression suffered both by the Lithuanians and the Jews, and the destruction of their cultures. She loved both Jews and Lithuanians as her own people. This is confirmed by her surviving diary, her most personal thoughts, and even her love drama. This is why her work and biography have such a strong emotional resonance today. First of all, they evoke pain because such a talent was lost. Such a unique poet was killed in July 1941, unfortunately by Lithuanian Jew killers. It is a grave truth and an enormously heavy sense of loss. On the other hand, Lithuanians also risked their lives while rescuing Matilda's family and her work during the Holocaust. One of these Lithuanians, a Catholic priest, Juozapas Matelionis, tried rescuing the Olkinaite family and managed to rescue manuscripts of Matilda's poetry before becoming a victim of the Soviet regime himself. Matilda's moving story resonates strongly with the current transformations of the Lithuanian collective historical mentality and may become a new symbolic site of memory shared by us all. In Lithuania, Matilda's biography and work are a particularly helpful contribution to the perception of the Holocaust as not just the historical tragedy of the Jews, but also a crime against us, against our own culture. As stated by contemporary Lithuanian writer Marius Ivaškevičius, this helps us understand, I quote, how much intelligence, how much talent is buried there in the mass burial pits, how many people whose children and grandchildren would have been building the modern Lithuania with us today, end of quote. Matilda's miraculously rescued literary work and diary written during the dramatic period of 1940 and 1941 include different cultural layers. From the perspective of Lithuanian literature, it is evident that Matilda's poetry matured under the influence of the most prominent Lithuanian neo-romantic poets, the classic authors of national modernism. In 1939-1941, she studied French language and literature at the Kaunas and Vilnius universities together with a new generation of young Lithuanian poets, the future existentialists, most of whom would go on to write as exiles in the United States after the war. She took courses of Lithuanian, French, and world literature taught by the most renowned professors of the time. During her studies, Matilda was already working on her first poetry book, which could not be released at the time because of Soviet censorship. Her writing style shifted gradually from natural lyricism to philosophical existentialist poetry. One of her most impressive philosophical poems, which was previously unknown and which I discovered in the interwar press while preparing the book, is The Cerulean Bird, translated into English by Laima Vince. It was written in the spring of 1940. It sounds like a symbolic prophecy of a looming tragedy. On the other hand, Matilda was also closely familiar with Jewish, especially Yiddish literature. A notebook of her poems rescued from oblivion ends with a translation of a poem by a Yiddish neo-romantic poet, Jacob Gottlieb, who worked in Kaunas during the interwar period. Thus, Matilda had started translating Yiddish poetry into Lithuanian and could have become an unsurpassable mediator between these literatures. Translations like these still remain scarce. She is also distinctive as a young female poet, whose style of poetry and efforts to gain recognition in the male-dominated field of literature are comparable to the work of other two Jewish women poets that were her contemporaries, Yiddish author Sarah Reisen and the classic Hebrew poet and Kaunas native Leah Goldberg. At the same time, Matilda also felt a kinship with the most famous Lithuanian female poet, Salomėja Nėris. Thus, in the context of literary history, Matilda Olkinaite is unique as a female progenitor of Jewish literature in Lithuanian language who emerged in pre-war Lithuania. After World War II, other Jewish authors who wrote in Lithuanian followed in her footsteps, such as the famous novelist Icchokas Meras, who was rescued during the Holocaust by a Lithuanian family. Sadly, Matilda was not destined to become a classic author of Lithuanian poetry like Leah Goldberg, who became a classic Hebrew poet in Israel. Nevertheless, the first Matilda's book, The Unlocked Diary, or Atrakintas dienoraštis in Lithuanian, published almost 80 years after Matilda's death and encompassing her poetry, diary, and research of the poet's biography, signifies the restoration of historical and existential justice, and even more, the reconstruction of lost cultural diversity. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to work on Matilda Olkinaite's book, study her manuscripts preserved and handed over by Professor Irena Veisaitė, collect the facts of her biography and her forgotten poems, reconstruct her face from the previously unknown archival photos. This was a special and very moving experience to me. I'm most thankful for collaboration to the book's translator into English, the Lithuanian-American writer Laima Vince, and to the Lithuanian book designer Sigutė Chlebinskaitė, who created the highly subtle artistic design of Matilda's book. Notably, Matilda's book was published thanks to not just the state's support, but also funds donated in a very short period of time by many people, Lithuanians, Israelis, Americans, British, etc. This was special existential charity, rescued from nameless oblivion by many hands. Matilda's talent ascends once again like a cerulean bird. It is my hope that soon after the English translation of the book is published, it will fly around the world. I call on everyone to follow that flight. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Kvietkauskas. In this next portion of our conference, I will engage in a discussion with our next speaker about how Matilda Olkinaite even came to be known. Our next speaker was crucial to this process. Here is a little bit more information about her. Irena Veisaitė was born in 1928 in Kaunas, Lithuania. Within days of the German invasion of Lithuania in June 41, Irena's mother was arrested from the hospital where she had been recovering from surgery, and Irena never saw her again. The 13-year-old was herself forced into the Kaunas ghetto with other family members. Later, she was rescued by a network of Lithuanians, including family friends who found her shelter with someone she had not previously known, Stefania Ladigiena, mother of 6 children and widow of a Lithuanian general arrested and executed by Soviet forces just 1 year previously. Irena credits Mrs. Ladigiena with not only saving her life, but also in restoring her faith in humanity. She has often referred to her as her second mother. Irena has lived in Vilnius since 1943. After the war, she finished school and attended university in Vilnius, continuing her studies in German language and literature at Lomonosov University in Moscow, and eventually successfully defending her doctoral thesis at Leningrad University in 1963. Professor Veisaitė is a German literature scholar, a theater expert, and founding member of the Lithuanian Open Society Fund, organized and funded by George Soros. She has served as 10 years as its chairman. She co-founded and chaired multiple other organizations in Lithuania. Throughout her professional career, she has published a significant number of articles and books on literature, theater, Lithuanian Jewish relations in the 20th century, and the Holocaust. Irena has received many multiple awards from Lithuanian, Polish, and German governments for her professional achievements and public activities, the most recent being the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 2020. So, Professor Veisaitė, I would like to take us back to the late 1980s, when I was in your apartment at the time. We were speaking and you were preparing the first ever article on Matilda Olkinaite, which was to be published in a journal of culture called Literatūra ir Menas, Literature and Art. And I have 2 questions about that time. Number 1, how did you come to learn of Matilda? And about when did you learn her? And 2, what was the significance in trying to get an article published about her in those days? What was the context? What was the atmosphere in what was then still Soviet Lithuania?
Thank you for your questions. I will try to answer them. My English is not perfect because I didn't learn the language in my early age. So please forgive me my mistakes.
Fine.
Yeah, I must say that Matilda, I didn't know anything about Matilda Olkinaite in my childhood and later on. She appeared in my life as a miracle, as something which really is undescribable. Suddenly, I got her copybook with her poetry, which was brought to me by a Lithuanian young man, no, maybe already not so young, but a wonderful person, Andrijauskas, who was writing a doctorate degree about Schiller, a German poet, and I was like his tutor. And one day he came and brought me a copybook, which you can see in the book about Matilda, a copybook, a Lithuanian copybook of those times, with full of poetry and some pictures, some drawings of Matilda. I can tell you I didn't sleep for many, many nights because I felt guilty that she is dead and I am alive. I immediately felt that she's a very talented young girl. She was 19 when she was killed. And I thought that she wanted very much to be heard by people. She was, I would say, more a Lithuanian poet than a Jewish poet. She was a patriot of Lithuania. She was she was She attended the school in Rokiškė, Vaižganto school, and she was already printed in many newspapers, Lithuanian, with her children poems, and with her such with her eilėraščiai, with her poems, yeah, 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 and I thought that I must give her voice. I must make her known.
How did you go about doing that? How did you go about finding out more about who she was?
No, this was later. We went with a group of people, with one of close friends of her sister, Genė Šukytė Grigėnienė, to Panemunėlis and to Rokiškės, and we spoke to people, and I heard only wonderful things about her father, who helped the whole little town, and about her, and I collected all this. And of course, in the Soviet times, Jewish poetry was not so was not so much accepted. And but it was already 89, I think, and I managed to publish a little article in Literatur ir Menas, which already Ina mentioned, and it was so she got somehow she got a little bit known, and other people also got interested in her and wrote and tried to find out who she was and what she did. But you know that it was a very revolutionary time. We gained our independence, and somehow I feel very guilty that I did not pay enough attention, and I did not go on with my research of her life and work. I feel very guilty about that.
I don't think you need to. I really don't, Irena, because you were the catalyst. Without you, this never would have appeared. And
No.
I have a number of follow-up questions to this. And number one is, I'd like to hear from you how that manuscript, that notebook of her poems survived, how it came into your hands. And then a follow-up to that is that in reading your part in this book, which was what we are talking about, the book that has been put together that all three panelists have been parted.
This book appeared thanks to, first of all, Laima Vince, who made her known, and she translated and she studied about her life and published a big article in English. And so the interest was growing. And then, of course, thanks to Mindaugas Kvietkauskas, who is a minister, but also a very, very good literary critic and researcher. And he's a wonderful translator and writer, and he paid a lot of attention to Matilda. And so finally we published this book, but you heard about, the minister told you already about it. Yeah.
What I'd like to know is how you came, I mean, in this summary, all three of our panelists have written some introductory summaries to this book. And in your part, you mentioned also receiving a diary from a person named Eduardas Matulionis.
Yeah.
Tell me, how did he come to your attention? How did you connect with him?
I was when I got this her copybook, this poetry, I started to look more for that. And Neniškytė, who was a very close friend of her, a Lithuanian young girl, they were very close, and I met her, And she helped me also to get contacts with people who knew her. And I don't remember how I got to know, maybe this Colonel Matulonis called me or I called him, I don't remember exactly now, but we met and he gave me her diary. I wrote everything down, what he said, and can you imagine, all the papers were disappeared, just disappeared, and I have nothing now. Also pictures disappeared. I don't know who has taken them, but now I can't already tell you all the details. But he was a Soviet colonel. He was participating in the war, Second World War, on the Soviet side. He came back and he was a Soviet colonel. And he gave me the diary. How he got it, I don't now remember well.
Okay. Okay. But what we have then are the core pieces are a notebook of her poems, and that came to you through your doctoral student, Mr. Andriauskas, and we have the diary that comes to you through Colonel Matulonis.
Yeah.
And Mr. Andriauskas, I don't know if we have mentioned it already, I think, Minister, you did, that he got this material of the notebook of poems from a chaplain at the local church in Panemunėlis, whose name is very similar to that of the colonel, but is different. His name is Matelionis. And can you tell me a little bit about how this priest came
No,
to
they have
have
nothing
that?
to do with each other. Matelionis was a priest, and they were very friendly with Olkinas. Olkinas had a drugstore, yeah, and he helped Matulonis to get, he helped him in medical questions. They became very, very close friends. And when the war started, when the Nazis came to Lithuania, he wanted, and he took the whole family into his house and wanted to save them, because it was clear that they are all in big danger. Actually, another young man who became later on a priest also wanted to save Matilda, because he knew what the so-called Baltaraištininkai, you can translate it.
White armbanders, white armbands, yeah.
Who were very anti-Semitic oriented, want to do with Jews. They are going to kill them. And he came to Matilda to tell her that she should run away. And he wanted to take her to his parents somewhere near to Panevėžys. But she did not go. She says, I can't leave my family. So she did not follow him, and she stayed with the family. And Matelionis tried to save them as well. But when Olkinas, who was really a special nice man, very generous, he saw a meldung,
a proclamation.
Yeah, that all Lithuanians who will help Jews or save them will be killed together with the Jews. So when he saw her, he did not want that the priest should risk his life because of the family, and they left all his house. And probably, I guess, he left this copybook with Matelionis. And Matelionis, priest Matelionis, kept it under the altar. And it survived there many years, and of his church, yeah. And when he came back from Siberia, I guess he took it out and gave it to Andriauskas, because he said, I don't know how to publish or what to do with this copybook. You live in Vilnius, you are connected with the university and so on. So you will find a way to make sense of it, yeah? And finally, he brought it to me. So this was the story.
Okay. Okay. So what we have is the two different pieces that represent Matilda, where her voice can be heard, her voice can be read, come to you through two really different sources and people who actually represent different destinies in post-war Lithuania. And one of them we know the track of, the other we know less. That is, we know less about how the colonel got the diary, and why it was that he kept it privately, rather than something like this ending up in KGB files or being thrown out somewhere, which could very well have happened.
No, Matellones wanted to save it. Otherwise, he wouldn't put it under the altar.
I'm talking about the colonel. Yeah. Is there anything else to this process? Anybody else that you think we ought to know about who helped bring Matilda out of anonymity, as the minister said, so that we could know about her, that we could learn about her life, so that she becomes not a statistic, but an actual individual who didn't
I think it is very important to understand who was killed, whom we lost. She would maybe be a second Salome Neris. It's one of our best poets. And I think that the horrible, horrible events of the Holocaust, all this, what happened in Lithuania, is such a tragedy, which we have to not to feel now guilty or something, but we have to know about it. And we have to remember it. She was a Lithuanian poet. She was a Lithuanian citizen. He was also a treasure of Lithuania. And she was so brutally killed. You know, some people not from Panemunėlis, from some other places who didn't know Olkinas, they came and they told her that they are going to save their life, and they thought they will go and take all their money. They thought, you know, there was such a prejudice that all Jews are very rich. This is such a lie. It is said that there's nothing worse than Jewish poverty. Yeah, it was a lot of poverty. So, but they took her with the whole family to the forest. They didn't find any money. They didn't save her. They killed the whole family. And there were people who saw it. It is all described in Laima Vincė's article. Very open and very straightforward. Yeah. And I think it is very important to know. It should never happen again. But we are already, our young generation does a lot to keep the memory, I must say. I can't take your time, but there are many things happening in Lithuania to memorize this really big tragedy. Not only, I think it was a tragedy, like I think our minister also said, it was not a tragedy only of the Jewish people, it was a tragedy of Lithuanian people as well. Because they were forced to become killers. Not forced maybe, but they were encouraged.
And some chose.
And without the German invasion, it would never happen like that. It would never happen like that. And you know, now appeared a book which is written by Ruta Vanagaite and the famous German historian Dickmann, which is called How It All Happened. And he shows very, very straightforward that it happened because of German encouragement and organization.
All of this, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Vesaita. Thank you for explaining a little bit more, giving us some more insight into how Matilda comes to be known to us and how this came through you, and for bringing this up to the current days, that it's not over, that what occurred is so monumental that it will take several generations to be able, if it could ever be, truly absorbed. So thank you for our discussion.
Sorry for my bad English, poor English.
Your English is just fine. It is just fine. Thank you. Okay, so we go on, and I'd like to introduce to you our next speaker, and she will share a little bit about some of the people who were most integrally involved in the process of bringing Matilda's story to us. She will share a little bit about her own life, her biography, as well as translations of selected poems. Laima Vince is a poet, novelist, playwright, and literary scholar. She is literary translator. Her novel, This Is Not My Sky, was translated into Lithuanian and published by Lithuania's largest publisher, Alma Litera, as Tai ne mano dangus. Her work of literary nonfiction, Journey into the Backwaters of the Heart, was also translated into Lithuanian and published by Alma Litera as Mūsų nepalaužia. Laima Vince has written 5 works of literary nonfiction, 5 plays, and a collection of poetry. She has published numerous literary translations, including the diary of and poetry of Matilda Olkinaite, The Unlocked Diary. She earned her MFA in writing and poetry from Columbia University School of the Arts and an MFA in nonfiction from the University of New Hampshire. She's the recipient of 2 Fulbright grants in creative writing and a National Endowment for the Arts Award in literature. She has also been awarded a Pen Translation Fund grant. Laima Vince is an assistant professor of English at the University of Southern Maine. She divides her time between New York, Maine, and Vilnius. Welcome, Laima. Welcome, Ms. Vince. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ina, for that very generous introduction. And I would like to thank the Embassy of the Republic of Lithuania in the United States and Ambassador Kriščiūnas and his staff for organizing this wonderful commemoration. Today, July 10th, is actually the day that we believe, working with historians, that Matilda Olkinaite and her sisters and her parents were murdered. And actually, in 2 years, she would have been 100 years old. So, and it's just such a pleasure to share this panel together with my really, my hero, a dearly esteemed person, Dr. Irena Vesaita. It's a pleasure to speak together with the Minister of Culture, Minister Kwiatkauskas. So I first, it's been so many layers of serendipity and synchronicity brought me into Matilda's story. In 2017, I was teaching in China, and I had to fly back to Lithuania for 2 weeks for some work I was doing with my dissertation project at the university. And a friend of mine who's a Litvak American, Phil Shapiro, got in touch, and he said, oh, there's this wonderful playwright, Neringa Daniena, who she's the head of a community theater, the Rokiškis Theater, and they have put on this marvelous play, a documentary play based on the diaries and poems of a young Litvak poet, Matilda Olkinaite, who died very young. Why don't you go and see it? So I drove out to Kupiškis to see the play, and I got there just as the lights were going down. And I hadn't met Neringa before. She got up on stage and she said, somewhere in this audience, there's a Lithuanian-American poet who will translate Matilda's poetry into English. And I thought, oh, wow, I haven't even heard the poetry yet. And as a translator, you never know, you have to connect with the work. You have to really be able to analyze and connect with the work to translate it properly. But when I watched the play, I mean, I was just crying. I was just so deeply moved by the poems, the diaries by Matilda's life, that I immediately found Neringa afterwards and said, yes, I'll translate everything. And the next morning already, she introduced me to a very important local historian named Violeta Alekniene, who starting from the 1990s had been researching the story of the Olkins and the Olkinas family and Matilda. And so she brought me to all the different sites where Matilda had lived, where she grew up, where the murder site, the theater had built this beautiful memorial to honor the Olkinas family and the Jaffe family who were killed at that site. And that was where my journey researching the life of Matilda Olkinaite began and what happened to her. And I met with her childhood friend, Lucia Nenishkite Vizgirdiana, with Gena Grigenina, with a number of different people who were able to share pieces of Matilda Olkinaite's life that I pieced together into my essay, The Silent Muse, which was, once it was published and it went online, the Smithsonian Magazine immediately became interested. And they sent their journalist, Matthew Shear, to Lithuania, and they asked me to he was to recreate my essay, but in the format that the Smithsonian Magazine uses. And so I took him to interview the people I had interviewed, and really spent a lot of time with him working on introducing him to the poetry of Matilda Olkinaite. And the photographer, Joachim Eckelson, who was assigned to take photos, he made a comment that really made me think. He said, oh, you feel sorry for this young woman because she died so young, but really she was just a schoolgirl writing poems in her diary. And I thought, no, I've read these poems and there's much more depth to the poems. And that, to me, they've really read like the poetry of Robert Frost. Every poem is either 8 or 9 syllables. She uses rhyme seamlessly and beautifully, not just end rhyme, internal rhyme. And the poems many of them are very pastoral and they're agrarian, and yet you could read a Matilda poem on one level, like a poem of Robert Frost, and say, oh, this is a lovely poem about a pastoral landscape and life in the country. But you see there's all these levels, all these layers of meaning in the poem that when you realize that, they're very, very powerful. So that was when, working with the historians at the Rokiškis Museum, we started establishing a trail of publication of where she had published and when, to be able, so nobody could ever say, oh, she was just a schoolgirl writing in her notebook. And then when we brought our work and met with Mindaugas Kvietkauskas, who was the vice director of the Literature Institute in Vilnius at that time, and he very generously agreed to come on board with our team and to really work together to publish this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. So what I would like to do now, because I imagine, we've been talking so much about Matilda and how wonderful her poetry is. So I would like to share some of her poetry and share excerpts from her diary. So I've put together a performance piece that is based on the essay. It should take about 15 to 20 minutes. If it goes a little over, you can either mute me or bear with me. But I hope to lead you into Matilda's world so that you can share in the beauty and the depth of her work and her inner life, just as we have all had the privilege to do with working with the original Lithuanian text. The Cerulean Bird, Matilda Olkinaite, June 6, 1922, July 10, 1941. A performance piece by Laima Vince. The Olkinas family lived near the train station in the village of Panemunėlis. Noachas Olkinas was the local pharmacist. He was well known in the community for his kindness, often administering medicine to the sick free of charge. Olkinaite would say to his customers, "Only pay me if my medicine helps you get better." Noachas Olkinaite was an intellectual who read Pushkin, Lermontov, and Dostoevsky. He was Jewish, a Litvak. He was a close friend of the Catholic parish priest Josepas Matelonis. They drank tea together in the rectory every Sunday afternoon after Mass. In the 1930s, as a gesture of friendship to Father Matelonis, Noachas Olkinaite donated an ornately carved oak confessional to the Panemonelis Church. The confessional is still in use today. Asta and Noachas Olkinaite's daughter Matilda was well known in the Rokiškis region as a gifted poet. Although Matilda was fluent in Yiddish, Russian, German, French, she wrote her poems exclusively in Lithuanian. From the age of 13, she began publishing her poems in Lithuanian literary journals. She was often invited to recite at literary evenings in Rokiškis and then later in Vilnius when she studied French and Russian literature at Vilnius University in 1940-1941, the last year of her life. Matilda's friends recalled that Matilda was warm, sincere, but at the same time reserved. During breaks between classes, she would walk the corridors deep in thought. She would pause and gaze out the window. When her friends saw her like this, they would say, "Shush, be quiet. Matilda is composing poetry." In the summer of 2018, I spent an afternoon with 93-year-old Lucia Nemiškytė Visgirdienė. Lucia's grandparents lived across the street from the Olkinaite family and operated a mill. As a child, Lucia became the best friend of Mika and Matilda. On Saturdays, both the Jewish family and their Lithuanian friends and neighbors observed the Sabbath together. At Sabbath dinner, the children would read, put on plays, and entertain the guests. Matilda's early poems were full of exuberance and love of nature. Lucia remembers Matilda's father encouraged creativity and self-expression in his children. "I'm not sure whether he was serious or half joking," Lucia recalled. But Mr. Olkinaite would say to Matilda, "I want to read a poem by you every Sabbath." From Matilda's diary, August 17, 1940. "I hear a cricket singing. He took up residence with us tonight. They say crickets bring good luck. So there, good fortune has come to live with us, to work and to create and to love and to be loved." The last time Lucia saw Matilda alive was when she went to visit her in the room she rented across the street from the synagogue on Pylimas Street in Vilnius. Matilda told Lucia that she had dedicated a poem to her and that she should look for it in a specific magazine. Lucia recited the poem to us from memory. The poem was written the day Lucia's family's home and mill in Panemonelis were privatized and the family forced to leave. "Your tiny room was white, filled with sunlight, and your shutters were white too. You dried mint on your windowsill. Every spring you picked violets and kept them in water on your table. And every night you wound your ancient clock. Tell me why that night the wind blew out your candle. Who rapped on your window, paused a moment, then left? It was your fate calling, knocking quietly on your white shutters. It stopped your old clock. It snuffed out your white candle. Your tiny room was white, filled with sunlight. But the world is so wide. Where will you go, beloved?" Matilda showed Lucia a pair of beautiful, expensive check shoes. She smiled and said, "My love gave me these." Lucia asked if Sheras, the son of the Rokiškis pharmacist, gave her the shoes. "Oh no, my true love," Matilda answered mysteriously. Lucia remembers Matilda was very happy that day. She was content with her life. That is how she likes to remember her, A few weeks later, the Nazis occupied Lithuania, and Matilda's young life of love and poetry was cut short. My people. A pair of dark eyes ignite once again, with a pain that cannot be extinguished. And they just keep walking past and away. But for me, Lord, there are no words. Do you hear? Do you hear that awful laughter? The hills, even the hills, shake with the sound, and the rivers will faint, and the seas will faint, and the stone will cry. The stone will cry. You are laughing. You walk past and keep on walking. But for me, Lord, there are no words for my horror. That laughter, that awful laughter, and dark eyes flash with an undying, relentless pain. As early as 1938, Matilda began to write about her premonitions that a terrible fate will befall the Jewish people. In March 1940, she wrote this poem in her notebook, a Jewish lullaby. My tiny little baby, why won't you fall asleep? Longing overwhelms you tonight. Longing crouches beside your cradle. The nights are long and dark, and the road leads far into the distance. On such a night you will leave me, my tiny little baby. And suffering will wait for you, like a beloved friend beside the gate. Great suffering and hardship will carry you silently through long generations. Long generations carry suffering from the cradle to the grave, suffering immense and deep and as endless as the night. Fall asleep now. It is a long road that will lead you into the night. Go to sleep. I will sing to you, my tiny little baby. Sometimes in her diary, Matilda confused her premonitions with her anxieties over the young man she elusively referred to as her love, or simply him, written with a capital. August 15, 1940. It's been a strange summer this year. Every goodbye is painful. And it seems as though everything is passing and soon will be gone forever. When I parted with my love, I felt as though I'll never see him again. I walked home from the station late at night. The moon was full and so bright that you could read a book by its light. A long shadow trailed after me as I walked, and it seemed as though this were the last night of summer, bright and humid and restless to the point of tears. Often, he does not even see me, and he doesn't understand me. I asked him to write something for me. He took that as my whim and wouldn't write anything. But I so wanted to have a few words that I could take away from this evening, which felt as though it were our last together. I wanted to read him a poem in French today, but already by the second line, I sensed that he was not interested. So I stopped reading. After some moments, when he becomes serious and asks me if I would agree to leave everything behind and run away with him, the sound of his words are painful to me, and I feel as though he were mocking me. It's no good. It can't be that love will always be like this for me. Before I always thought, or perhaps I was just trying to convince myself, that my feelings will always match his, which were unknown to me then. He is not keeping a diary now. He sleeps soundly. I wish him well. Matilda's young man, her diary reveals, showed her affection and then withheld it. Matilda impetuously penned this poem between diary entries 8 months before her death. Her handwriting is rushed, as though she wrote the poem hastily, expressing emotions weighing on her. Was this a premonition, or was she frightened by the war that was drawing closer and closer to Lithuania? Oh, how many have gathered in my home of mourning. I hold an infant in my arms, and my infant is death. They brought a silver sash and armfuls of lilies white, and I cannot thank them. I cannot smile. All around me are lilies, white, white, and faces wearing bright smiles. But my hands are so cold. A black ribbon is tied in my hair. Someone has trampled my love, the whitest of white blossoms. And among the wilted lilies, I see them, I speak to them. Oh, how many have gathered, and no one will see love. I hold an infant in my arms, and my infant is death. Many of Matilda's poems express a premonition of death, but on the pages of her diary, Matilda would often ponder the meaning of life. September 11, 1940. I'm thinking now about what a person's natural state of being is. Whether it is to live a simple, gray, everyday life where we approach things with a light and open touch, or whether it is to live in an enlightened state of being between us and phenomenon, and a deeper feeling arises that raises the level of our thoughts, which gives everything meaning, placing it all on a higher plane. Is a person's nature gray and mundane, and only very rarely does it rise into a higher spiritual plane? Or is it full of light, call it sacred, and only by force pushed down into the level of gray, everyday existence? And where is the true me? Is it me who gossips about others, chatters away, gets angry, and has little patience? Or is it the me who rises above and creates, who loves and trembles in eternal bliss when the evening spreads across the vast fields and the heavens overhead are wide and open and endless, and when in the sacred silence you hear the word of God speaking to you? What is the natural state of a human being? Perhaps both are natural to us, just like hate and love, like destruction and creativity, like keeping watch and sleeping. Now, excuse me, but it's already 8 o'clock. Should I keep reading or just skip to the end and wrap this up in the interest of time? Dear moderator, tell me what to do.
I would say that if you have perhaps one more poem, we could hear that, but we do need to allow time for question and answers. Okay.
Okay, so then I'll go right to the conclusion, to the very end.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. This is just a description of her last day and one last poem. Okay. All right. When the Olkinaite family and the other Jews of Panemunelis were arrested, friends and neighbors came forward to help, bringing food, some offering to rescue them by hiding them. They did this at the risk of their own arrest and execution. However, these people were powerless in the face of the war machine of the Nazis and their local collaborators, known to local people as Boltereiche, or the White Armbanders. On a beautiful hot day in early July 1941, at a bend in the village road that leads out of Panemunelis towards Kavoliškės, the White Armbanders arrived on bicycles. They left their bicycles in the forest across the road from an isolated farm strand that belonged to the farmer Petras Šarkauskas and began digging a ditch. Tree roots prevented them from digging very deep, so they gave up and took their shovels to the other side of the road and began digging in the peat bog that belonged to the Kavoliškės manor. The grass grew lush there, but recently the farmers had harvested the hay, leaving the field flat and empty. Then they left, only to return shortly afterwards, riding their bicycles alongside a wagon load of people pulled by 2 horses over the rutted road. An armed guard sat at the front of the wagon and another in the back. More armed men rode alongside the wagon on bicycles. The captives were blindfolded and their heads were bowed. When the wagon reached an incline, the captives were ordered to climb out and walk the rest of the distance. At gunpoint, they were led towards the crest of a hill where the field met dense forest. The guards beat them with clubs as they trudged and stumbled up the hill. Hidden behind a haystack, an 8-year-old girl named Aldona watched. She was the daughter of the local farmer, Petras Šarkauskas. Their hired laborer, Bronius, ran to find the farmer to tell him what was happening. The farmer came into the yard and climbed up onto the hay rack. The farmer his little girl, and the hired hand soon could no longer see what was happening, but they could hear the screams and cries, which continued for a few hours before the final gunshots came. The cerulean bird. Off in the distant skies soared the cerulean bird, flying endlessly ecstatic, singing a golden hymn about happiness eternal, joy that cannot be broken, a smile that never ceases. Alongside barns, hillocks, through forests, deserts, with heavy footsteps, the giant made his way with a bitter glance, scanning the landscape, searching for the cerulean bird, who flew along the heavens, singing a golden hymn about happiness eternal. Off in the distant skies soared the cerulean bird, and 3 arrows pierced her, carrying black death within. And they tore open the breast of the cerulean bird. And the heavens were shattered, and not with the ecstatic hymn about happiness eternal, but with the cry of the cerulean bird, her last trembling breath, her bottomless longing. Oh, the quivering bow, why ever did you release that most poisoned arrow? Who will sing now about happiness exquisite, ecstasy that never ceases, and a hymn that rings eternal? That day, no one dared approach the killing site. The next day, Mrs. Sharkauskas and the neighbor, Mr. Vaitkevichus, walked across the field to take a look. They found a shallow grave. Sharkauskas pushed his rake handle into the earth. The bodies were covered with only a few centimeters of soil. He covered the bodies with more soil and branches, forming a burial mound. No one quite knows the circumstances, but before the Olkinas family was killed, Noachas Olkinas managed to pass his daughter's notebook of poems to his friend, Father Matelonis. The priest hid the notebook inside the great altar of the Panemonelis church. 3 years later, the Soviets drove the Germans out of Lithuania. In 1950, Father Matelonis was deported to Siberia. The notebook of poems remained hidden. During the Soviet occupation, Alfredas Andriauskas, a linguist and organist at Panemonelis church, recovered Matilda's notebook of poems and brought them for safekeeping to Holocaust survivor Irena Veisaitė in Vilnius. In autumn 2017, I visited Irena and took photos of the pages of the poems and diary with my phone so that I could translate them. I could only think that if I had died so young, just as I was beginning to find my voice as a poet, I would have wanted someone to find my notebook and to share my poems with the world. It is my wish for my translations to breathe life back into these poems, written out long ago with a fountain pen on the brittle, yellowed pages of an old school notebook. Poetry speaks to us at our deepest level of humanity. A poem invites us to live the experience of another. Matilda absorbed the tumultuous times she lived in through the language of poetry. Matilda was barely 19 years old when she was murdered. She'd only just begun to find her voice as a poet. And yet, being so young, she documented the horror of her times and expressed it through poetry. She perceived the Shoah and at the same time sensed the fundamental tragedy of humanity that repeats itself age after age. Despite it all, she reveled in the fragile beauty of provincial life. It was a time of shadow, but also a time of light. It was a time of shattering contrasts, good and evil playing out on the world stage. The sun expired, the sun died, and you died along with the sun. And now you lie and gaze at the violets and the butterflies among the blooms.
Thank you so much, Laima. Thank you for bringing Matilda's voice to us through her poetry, through the excerpts that you read from her diary. We have a chance to hear what it is that all three of you have been talking about, and it is very precious. So I'd like to open up the conference to questions, some of which have already been written. But I'd like to add a final note before we do so, because many have asked about how to purchase the book, The Unlocked Diary. It is now, the Lithuanian version is currently available in bookstores in Lithuania, as well as Lithuanian language online booksellers, places I would suspect like Patogu Pirkti. An English translation of the book will be ready by early autumn, and details of how to purchase those will be available and posted on the Lithuanian Embassy's Facebook page in Washington, the US Lithuanian Embassy's Facebook page. So you'll be able to find it there. Now I'd like to turn to some of your questions. And one of them that I'd like to address to Minister Kwietkauskas is a question about Matilda's murderers. Do we know who they are? I read in your introduction that you had looked at some of the KGB files, that you had done some research on people who were brought to the attention of the Soviet authorities. What can you tell us about what you found?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gokin, for your question. It is really an important question. And when I started compiling the book and doing the research, I went to check the archives at our so-called special archive of Lithuania, where the KGB files are kept. And the KGB tried to find the murderers of the Olkin family. Of course, their interrogations, files from their interrogations have to be used cautiously, because we know the KGB methods, the threats, the possible tortures that were applied for the interrogated. But I think that most of the testimonies about what happened in Panemunėlis in 1941, in summer 1941, clearly show that Olkinas family was killed by the Lithuanian squad of a so-called white armbanders, the local voluntarily police squad, and the main person that was accused by the KGB was the head of that squad, Henrikas Duda, who was from the same region of Panemunėlis town, who served at the Lithuanian military before the war, and who later also served, interestingly, at the Soviet militia, and returned to his native town when the Nazi occupation, when the Nazis entered Lithuania and organized this squad. Henrikas Duda, according to the KGB, later emigrated to the United States and lived in Detroit, Michigan, under an alien name. That was the hypothesis brought by the KGB. I'm calling this a hypothesis. I cannot tell if it's a correct information, but they were not able to track him down. So I'm not a professional researcher of the Holocaust crimes, of course, and I think that must be checked, and that must be done by the professional historians who research such cases. Those files are there, and I am telling this story, I'm revealing this information in the introductory article for the book that I wrote for Matilda's book.
Thank you. Another question that goes to Professor Veisaitė. Why do you think that Matilda is more of a Lithuanian poet than, let's say, a Jewish poet? What brings you to say that?
I told it because I never read one poem of her written in Jewish. She understood Jewish. She wanted to introduce Jewish poetry to Lithuanian readers, but I never saw something what she has written in Jewish, in the Yiddish language.
Right.
So, I know how popular she was in children journals, how popular she was in Rokiškis when she was a school girl. She was writing all official, you know, from the school in different, for different occasions, she was writing poems. So I really don't know if she can be called a Jewish poet. She is of Jewish origin. Like Heinrich Heine is of Jewish origin, but he's a German poet. So I can only, this is my answer to your question.
Thank you. Staying with the Yiddish theme, there is another person who wanted to know, is there plans for a Yiddish translation of her poetry or a Hebrew translation of her poetry?
I never heard about a Jewish translation of her poetry. I think maybe it will now happen, that somebody will be interested.
I think that is a good idea. That would, of course, be a challenge. First of all, Hebrew edition. I think we should also think about that after the English edition of the book appears.
A number of people have written to thank all of our panelists and to offer a great deal of praise for your presentation. So I wanted to pass that along to you as well before we go on to some more questions. And one of those who are listening in has asked two questions. One which is, can someone expand on the relationship between Matilda Olkinaite and Salomeo Neris, and if they ever met? And the same person is asking about what was the fate of the colonel, Mr. Matulionis. Do we know more about him? So that's open to anybody who would like to address it.
So
I think that the life of priest Matulionis is known. He was arrested by the Soviets. He was taken to Siberia. Then he came back to Lithuania when after Stalin's death, and he passed away. I think, I don't remember now. I don't want to lie, so I don't remember. But he. I know that he came back, I think, about 55 in 1955. This I definitely know.
Oh, excuse me, I probably wasn't very clear, Professor Vesaita. We were talking about the colonel, Matulionis. Their names are so similar, but the colonel who had her diary, do we know more about him and who he was and how it could have been that he got that diary?
This I told already, that unfortunately I don't know, but he was a pupil in Rokiškis. He knew Matilda from the independent times of Lithuania. He became a Soviet colonel, so he was in the Soviet army. He was probably a member of the Communist Party. He was a Soviet activist in some way. I met him when he was already in old age. He was already not working anymore. And he passed away in Vilnius and is buried in Vilnius, but already later, after we met, I don't know. I think this is what I can tell about him. He was a nice person. He was a nice person.
I might also add, if you would allow me, as far as I have established, the Colonel Matulionis was from the Rokiškis city, and he attended the same gymnasium as Matilda. He was already involved in communist activities there as a gymnasium student. So most probably he knew Matilda's elder brother, who was also a left-wing activist at that time. Most probably he knew Matilda's family, the Olkin family. It is, of course, now difficult to establish how the diary ended up with him, but he was from the same circle of people.
Yeah, but I want also to emphasize that in her diary, Matilda didn't join her brother and didn't join communists. She didn't like communists. And so she blamed them. So, and this was quite outstanding position in those times.
Yeah, and about Salome Neris, about her relation to Salome Neris, Matilda highly admired Salome Neris's poetry, and she obviously followed her in her early poetical style. I don't know if they ever met. I doubt that. Salome Neris was already celebrity in Lithuania at that time, but Matilda also strongly condemned Salome Neris in her diary for joining the communist regime. She was very clear about that, so she was an admirer, both an admirer of Neris and her harsh critic for her pro-communist views.
Actually, I could read the excerpt where she discusses her views about Salome Neris and her choices regarding the Communist Party. She writes, okay, this is September 1st, 1940. Matilda noted, "Today it is exactly 1 year since the war began. The newspapers have marked the occasion by writing their headlines all in capital letters. It is horrific when you think about it, but I'm not taking that to heart. The day that I must leave is drawing closer. This year I will need to study hard and put all my energy into my work. I am considering studying Slavic languages as an elective, but I will give it some more thought. Maybe, whatever I end up choosing, I would like to work very seriously at my studies this year. I'd like to improve my grade in the Lithuanian language." And then she writes, "What I should do is sit down and work on editing several poems. Oh, that poetry collection of mine. I am working on it with no inspiration, knowing that no one will publish it anyway. There is nothing in my poems that is relevant. I write about the pain of suffering over centuries at a time when we are required to sing about how happy we are today and about our bright tomorrow." So those are some of her thoughts on the Soviet occupation of Lithuania and how it affected artists like herself.
Which brings me to another question from one of our listeners, and that was, is patriotism the only reason Matilda wrote her poetry in Lithuanian rather than Yiddish or any of the other languages? Did she know any other languages besides Yiddish and Lithuanian? And the same person asks, why would the NKVD or KGB be interested in these people and these individuals?
So if I can, I'll answer the first part of the question, and then maybe Mindaugas wouldn't mind answering the second part about the KGB, because he did that research. But she attended school in the Lithuanian language, and she was very integrated into the spirit of her times, that interwar period, which was very idealistic. It was, people were excited about a newly independent Lithuanian state. The educational system was very strong. She received a lot of support from her Lithuanian literature teachers as a high school student, and then she studied with several well-known Lithuanian writers and poets at Vilnius University, so she was very inspired by that background. She was fluent in Russian, German, Yiddish, French, Polish, Lithuanian, and she does bring in her diary, she does have some places where she'll use a phrase or a word in Russian or in Polish. She uses some Yiddish words but translates them into Lithuanian. So she was living in this multilingual world, and you really see in her poems a synthesis of Jewish culture, of the biblical tradition, of this Yiddish worldview, together with this Lithuanian worldview. Her writing reflects the times that she lived in and the world that she lived in. And I think that she was really too young to be political in a very strong, well, okay, I take that back. She was political. She did not believe in communism, and she was not happy about the Soviet invasion of Lithuania. But she really was very integrated into the spirit of her times. And the question about the KGB, I'm going to pass that on to the minister.
So, well, generally speaking, the Soviet regime tried to follow and persecute the Nazi collaborators. So Holocaust perpetrators among them, they were their enemies. But of course, we also used these accusations not only against the true perpetrators, but also against some anti-Soviet fighters, anti-Soviet dissidents. So sometimes against the innocent people. So that's why the KGB research must be used very cautiously, and it is very ambiguous in some cases, and it must be attended very professionally.
Thank you. Let me see. Someone writes that Professor Vesaita's response about Jewish poetry reminds them of a question raised by the artist Esther Lurie. I believe she was from the Kovno ghetto, who was imprisoned in the Kovno ghetto. Lurie led a discussion on the question, what is Jewish art? Anybody care to address that? Is Jewish art only...
I'm not able to answer. It is a very big question, and this is a separate discussion, not for this presentation, I think.
Okay. Another question,
maybe our minister can say more about that or tell more about that. I don't know. But for me, it is hard to say what is Jewish art. I don't know. I can't define it.
It's a very subtle question, actually. It's a very subtle question. We might ask as well as, what is a Lithuanian or an American art? We could ask if Laima Vincent's work, for example, is Lithuanian or American or both. I think sometimes the artist can transcend those national boundaries, and really, true art is universal and open for us all. And I think Matilda is one of such examples. She actually transcended the national boundaries, the boundaries of even the religious boundaries in some cases. I would also think that.
You know, I agree with the minister on that, because it's really evident when you start analyzing her poems that they're universal. They are universal. They, you know, in particular her poem, a word, Žodis, which is really about her, you know, her feelings about war, how she wishes she could stand up and just utter one word and all the chaos and nonsense in the world would stop and people would come to their senses. And it's very much a feeling that many people feel now in our current international situation. So I do think in that sense, culturally, her poems translate very well, because really I think any culture can embrace the ideas and the thoughts and the feelings in her poetry.
I want you also to say one thing, that she had she wrote such a sentence which was very pessimistic in her copybook. Viskas praeina, tu passé, tu als vergeet. She wrote it in 5 languages, I think. Not English. English was not popular in those times. But she knew many languages, and but she was a Lithuanian poet. You can't you can't avoid this, because she wrote in Lithuanian. She wrote a lot, I felt, in her poetry. I don't know if our minister will agree with me, but I felt in her poetry a lot of Lithuanian folklore.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, may I jump onto that, Irena?
Go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to agree with Irena. This is Lithuanian folk song. The rhythms of Lithuanian folk song are definitely in her poems. And I really worked with that when I was translating them and counting syllables and working with the rhythms of the poems. She loved to sing. And she sang Yiddish songs, she sang Lithuanian songs. She loved to get together with her girlfriends and sing. And that comes through in the diary. And their imagery from Lithuanian folk song is very powerful in her poetry. I'd say one of the strongest images that comes through in her poems is Saule, the sun, the image of the sun goddess, and the sun in the chariot rolling across the sky. So there, that influence of ethnography and of Lithuanian folklore is strong in her work. That was also true of many neo-romantic poets of her time period in Lithuania. It was also the times that she lived in.
Thank you. There are a couple of people who have written and said and mentioned and asked, is any part of Matilda's Olkinaite story now part of school curriculums in Lithuanian? Are they already, are there plans to be? Is it her story? Is it her poetry? Is it both? Can any of you speak to these types of developments? Are they taking place?
Yes, Matilda Olkinaite's biography and her a couple of her poems were already included into Lithuanian school curriculum. I think it happened already 4 years ago, and they are already included into our textbooks, part of our Holocaust education at the Lithuanian gymnasiums, along with a diary written by Itzhak Rudashevsky, a teenage boy at the Vilna ghetto.
Thank you. And someone asks, I would like to know more about the relationship between the Catholic and Jewish communities in Lithuania. Matilda's father gifting a confessional to a parish church does seem unusual from our perspective today, particularly in the United States. So can anyone talk about Lithuanian Jewish relationships? Catholic and Jewish, I mean, in the religious sense, in the religious communities. Oh, don't everybody answer all at once.
Irena, maybe you could comment from your experience.
Yeah. It is also a quite complicated question, because Christianity is a pratesimas, is
a continuation.
A continuation of. It comes from the Jewish religion, And all Jesus and all apostles and all first Christians were Jews. No one was not Jewish. So, but, and then it developed and they separated. And I must say that the church, which is created by, in my opinion, by people, not only by God, became anti-Semitic, really. And in the Middle Ages, Jews were persecuted, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic views in Christianity. But all that finished with the appearance of the Pope John the 23rd, and especially our beloved Pope Jan Paul II, who has asked for forgiveness for the anti-Semitic policy of Christianity. He prohibited to say in the prayers or during the mass, mess. He prohibited to say that Jews killed Christ. This is really, so this is not anymore. So I think that Christianity is a further development, and I think it is very valuable that, for me, Christianity is formulated by to love your neighbor, to know how to forgive. This is for me Christianity, no, not in my understanding. It is not a very scientific answer, but it is the answer how I feel it.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe we are coming close to the end of our conference, but before we do, we have stayed with Matilda Olkinaite. I have two statements. We've stayed with Matilda Olkinaite, but one of our listeners has also asked about another very well-known writer and novelist, Grigory Kanovich. And he's asked, is there any plans to celebrate and promote his work, which are 10 novels, and dedicated to the life and death of the Lithuanian Jewish community? So any thoughts about that? Any plans about that?
Yes, well, Grigory Kanovich is one of the most celebrated contemporary writers in Lithuania. He was awarded the most prestigious Lithuanian National Prize for Arts and Culture. He holds one of the highest national state awards, and all his novels are published in Lithuanian language simultaneously as they appear in other languages. His main language of his work is Russian, but he simultaneously prepares the Lithuanian translations of his work, supervised by the author himself. So Grigorijus Kanovičius is also almost a bilingual Jewish author, and one of his novels, the Shtetl Romance, which is also translated into English, was recently acknowledged by the Lithuanian literary critics as one of the top 30 books during the last 30 years of Lithuanian independence. So he's one of the most celebrated authors in Lithuania, and I'm really happy to know him personally, and he's a great personality. I really admire him. I would also like to, I think I would also like to address questions by the same participant, Dmitry Kanovich, about the anti-Semitic occurrences in Lithuania. I must stress that the official policy of Lithuanian government is zero tolerance tolerance against anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic expressions, and apply the legal basis, the laws, according to all norms of the European Union, and all such expressions or occurrences of anti-Semitism are really being condemned by the heads of our state and persecuted by our police.
May I just respond? I just saw a comment on the screen. The priests who helped Jewish residents were the true Christians, as opposed to the church. And I think that one little piece of the story that with so much information that we didn't talk about was the depth of the friendship between Father Matilonis and Noachas Olkinas, that Father Matilonis managed to hide the family in the rectory for a week, and Noachas Olkinas went out at night to take a walk, and he saw a poster, a proclamation that anyone caught hiding Jews would be executed, and he immediately feared for Father Matilonis's life, and he turned himself in that very night. And so the family made this moral decision. They did not want to sacrifice the life of another to save their own. And that, for me, is such a strong component that shows the depth of this friendship and the sensitivity. And I think that transcends politics. It transcends hatred. You know, when you just reflect on that for a moment, I mean, for me, that's one of the most powerful components of this story, is that both friends were willing to risk and sacrifice their lives to save the other, Father Matilonis and Noachas Olkinas.
Thank
I
you,
would
Laila.
like also to join our minister in his opinion about Kanovich. I think he's a very, very important contemporary writer, and it is a very interesting case because Kanovičius is a Lithuanian Jewish writer. He writes in Russian. He is very well translated by a Lithuanian translator, Feliksas Vaitiekūnas. And they are really such a couple, wonderful couple. And I think that Kanovičius is a classic, and he created the epos of Lithuanian Jewry in the 20th century especially.
As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to end our conference with a slideshow of photos of Matilda Olkinaite. And also, as I said, music, some photos of performances, a photo of a statue that's been erected in her honor. Thank you very much, our panelists today, for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and it sounds like also your love for Matilda Olkinaite. And thank you all of our participants and listeners for your interest in her and her story, and what it means. A good day, be safe to all, and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ina.
Where the wild wind snows across wild